The famine learned the land by heart. It moved across hill and valley the way a shadow moves when the sun lowers, not with anger, with certainty. In Canaan, the wind came thin, the earth split into fine lines, and the wells learned the discipline of saying no. Jacob rose each morning into the hard light and counted what could no longer be counted. He weighed grain with a caution that had once been hope. He watched sheep hold their ribs like secret doors. The tents sounded different when hunger listened. Movement became sparse, speech careful. Fathers learned to measure children's laughter as if it were oil, to pour just enough so the day could burn without wasting the night. Word moved as water moves when it finds the slope. There was grain in Egypt. It sounded like rumor first, something men said when they wanted to warm their hands. Then it became a report with shape and weight. Caravans returned with sacks fuller than fear. Names were spoken. A governor who counted like a mason and did not blink. A man who had read the future inside the dreams of kings. Jacob stood in that thin light and looked east. The road that once took a boy away now held the possibility of bringing life back. He sent for his sons, and the room filled with the slow tread of men who had learned to avoid questions they could not afford to answer. He told them to go, all but the youngest. He kept Benjamin near, with the fierce tenderness of those who have already lost more than one life can hold. The older brothers nodded, because nodding cost less than speech. They took empty sacks, and hope that still did not know its own name, and stepped onto the road. Dust rose. Distance rose with it. They passed the places where grass once learned their footprints. They did not say the old name out loud. The wind might carry it too far. In Egypt, the city woke under the same blue vault that had covered 1,000 mornings. The storehouses rose like new hills, their mouths sealed with careful seals. Joseph stood on a terrace where he had stood 100 times and watched the gates open. The first line of buyers arrived at dawn and did not stop coming when the sun burned the stone. His officials spoke the measures with a calm that borrowed from his own. The books held steady. The scales stayed true. Some faces came once and left. Some came again and learned to bow without being taught. And then a cluster came that walked like memory. They did not look like men from palaces. They looked like hills and wind. They looked like miles. Joseph watched them as one watches a dream that has crossed into noon. He did not call them brothers, not with his lips, not yet. He named them as strangers to the book that kept the order of buyers, and the book accepted the name without protest. They bowed to the ground, and the ground remembered the visions of a boy long ago. Old images stood up inside him, and did not say, "I told you so." They simply stood. He held himself like a wall, and asked questions any governor would ask. Where are you from? How many? How long will you remain? Their words gathered together and made a picture of a man and a tent and a hunger. They said enough to awaken what had slept, and not enough to settle it. He felt the ache of the past, and did not let it guide his hand. He needed truth, not vengeance. He shaped a test as one shapes a vessel that can pour mercy without spilling judgment. Bring your youngest. Prove the shape of your story. Leave one of you here, and come back with the rest of it. Simeon stayed in the quiet that follows a hard choice. Ropes learned his wrists while grain learned their sacks. Silver hid where it had not been placed, because mercy sometimes announces itself like trouble, so that pride will not hear it coming. They turned toward home with more weight on their animals, and more weight on their chests. Joseph watched them vanish into the distance, and stood very still. When his officials spoke, he answered in the language of the land, but when he turned toward a private corner, a different tongue rose in him like a remembered well. He named God aloud without needing to explain to anyone who was listening. The brothers carried grain into a camp that had learned how to be quiet. Jacob's eyes counted as quickly as his heart. He measured the sacks and the faces and the absence that sat down beside them. When the silver slid into the light, Fear slid with it. Not all currency buys relief. He said no to the road that asked for Benjamin. He said it the way a man refuses a blade at his own throat. Days passed and then returned as the same day with less food in it. The sacks went thin. Faces went thin with them. Hunger has more patience than argument. Judah stepped forward with words that had learned humility by walking a long way. He did not offer strategy. He offered himself. Make me the promise that stands in front of the next blow. He spoke as one who had counted cost and still moved toward it. Jacob listened and found in the voice of this son an echo of a God who had never mocked him. He let go. The boy stood up with a pack that did not look heavy. He looked once at the place where his father's hand always reached for his shoulder, and then turned toward the road that kept asking for more courage than any one household should own. Joseph watched the second arrival from a distance that protected both of them. He saw the younger face and felt something inside loosen, and then tried to restrain itself. He ordered the best table. He placed measure and kindness in the same room and stood between them as if he belonged to both. The brothers ate without comfort. Fear sat on the bench like another guest. Cups went where cups go when meals end. Silver went where silver goes when tests are not yet finished. Dawn moved them toward the gate. Hooves learned urgency. A steward's voice learned accusation. The search learned what it had been told to find. Benjamin stood with empty hands, while the cup shone like a wound. The brothers tore garments the way men still do when grief beats them to the ground. Judah stepped forward again, not as a bargainer, as a man whose heart had placed itself where only love can survive. He offered himself with words that were not performance. He asked for the boy's life as if it were his own, which it had become. Joseph listened to a story he had never heard from that mouth. The story of a father who would not live through another loss, and sons who had learned what their early years had refused to learn. The room turned and no one else felt it. He sent the attendants away then, because there are moments when truth asks for only two kinds of witnesses, God and tears. He spoke to them in the language no one in that house knew he owned. He named himself. He did not describe the pit. He did not rehearse the price of a slave. He described a hand larger than any of theirs, a hand that had taken evil and grown bread from it. He held them while they still tried to comprehend that the man in linen and gold was made of the same hours and dust as the boy they had sold. Time met itself in that room and did not break. He asked for his father. He arranged wagons the way a son arranges comfort for a parent who has known too many hard benches. He filled them with the kind of goods that turn a journey into mercy. He sent them ahead with a message that would need to be carried as carefully as a sleeping child. I am alive. Come down. Do not fear the road. God has made me a steward, where famine thought it would be king. The brothers rode toward home, with hearts that kept breaking and mending at the same speed. The land unrolled beneath them. The tents rose like a memory that had waited this entire time for someone to tell it what to do next. Jacob saw dust first, and then the shapes inside it. He measured the speed of hooves and the urgency of gestures. He heard the sentence no man expects to hear after so long. Your son lives. He stood as one stands when the body does not know whether to fall or run. The robe that once had been stained lay folded near the place where he prayed. He took it up and set it down because hands require tasks when the heart is not yet ready for joy. He asked questions until the questions themselves realized they could no longer keep him from leaving. He rose. Age climbed into a cart and found that faith still knows how to sit up straight when it is needed. The road into Egypt carried more than one generation. Children learned the taste of the air by leaning forward at the edge of wagons. Mothers gathered belongings that could survive the change of countries. Fathers touched old stones as if to thank them for having been firm. The procession moved past places where God had once met Jacob with ladders and new names. He spoke those places to himself, so they would not think he had forgotten them. He spoke the name of the God of his father and his father's father, and waited for night to answer. Night did answer. Near Beersheba he offered sacrifice, and the darkness brought a voice he had always known. Go, I am with you. I will bring you up again. He slept as a man sleeps when the old fear has finally lost interest. Egypt opened its gates without anger. The Nile lifted its wide shoulders. Joseph prepared the land to receive a family that would one day become a nation, and for now was only a handful of tents and faces he had kept alive by learning patience. He rode out to meet them in a chariot the city had learned to admire and forgot to be a governor for a while. He became a son running. The cart stopped. The old man stood with hands that no longer trembled because they had found what they were made for. Joseph placed his face against a neck that had waited too many years and let tears finish a job his strength could not do. The world around them became a hallway down which only mercy was allowed to walk. They settled in Goshen because shepherds live more easily where animals can teach them what to do next. Joseph stood before Pharaoh with a family behind him and answered questions that let a king judge nothing except the size of a reunion. Land was given because God had already given it in a way kings cannot take back. The years flowed. The famine finished its sentence and sat down. Egypt continued, taller in granaries, and in the story it told itself about wisdom. Israel continued, taller in sons and in names that had waited for such ground. Jacob grew smaller in body, the way blessed men do at the end. He called for the boy who was no longer a boy, and placed hands that had crossed rivers on grandsons who had not yet learned to read. He crossed those hands again on purpose, because God had always delighted in crossing lines that men have drawn too straight. He spoke over Manasseh and Ephraim words that sounded like water finding its bed. He spoke over his sons with memories that carried both truth and tenderness. He asked to be carried home when he lay down for the last time. He had seen the face he never thought to see again, and that sight had taught him how to die without fear. The day of mourning covered the land with a careful shadow. Egyptians stood still by the road because grief is a language that does not require translation. The procession moved north with measured steps, carts noisy with wheels that knew the route by heart. They buried him where promises had first put down roots, and the dust received him as it receives kings and shepherds without arguing about which is greater. Then they turned back toward Egypt, which was not home, and yet had become a place where many lives found room to breathe. Fear tried to return when the old man was gone. Brothers who had learned humility still had not learned how to trust a mercy that did not carry conditions. They approached Joseph with words that tried to make safety out of apologies and arrangements. He listened with eyes that had wept enough to be clear. He did not rehearse the past, because the past had already been to school. He named what only grace can name. You meant evil. God meant good. He did not put them under his foot. He put them under his care. He promised provision with the same voice that used to count sacks of grain. He comforted them as men comfort children who wake in the night, forgetting that morning is already scheduled. Time layered itself over those days the way paint layers itself over stone. Children learned to run under a sky that had forgotten famine. Elders learned to sit like trees that know their season. Joseph walked the line between two worlds and did not stumble because the same hand that had steadied him in pits and palaces still had not let go. He kept his work honest. He kept his memory clean. He kept his hope pointed in the direction of a promise too large for one lifetime. When his own end drew near, he did not clutch at Egypt's gold as if it could anchor him. He told them to carry his bones when God carried them out. He tied his future to a road that had not yet been built and a sea that had not yet been divided. He stared east sometimes in the last light and saw nothing that eyes could draw, and that nothing filled him with a contentment that outlasts explanation. He had become a man who could wait inside a story that would not finish until long after his breath had stepped away from him. He thought of the first robe without bitterness. He thought of a well without fear. He thought of a prison without resentment. In each place, a quiet had been teaching him a language he would one day be fluent in. The language of purposes that arrive in ordinary work. The language of forgiveness that does not ask for interest. The language of a God who does not hurry and therefore does not fail.